Well, the first thing, EMS is a system, right? So, and it's a system of what we call chains of survival or links of particulars that need to come together for an optimal result of a patient. The first thing is recognition of an emergency, right? Is there an emergency? And the second thing right after that is activating the 911 system. So those are two big things. If you see something that's going on, somebody having a medical emergency, recognize that they are having a medical emergency and immediately activate 911.
Before we dive in, it's important to remember that the information we provide is for informational purposes only. Every situation is unique, and decisions regarding your health or legal matters should be made after consulting with your own doctor or lawyer. Our aim is to inform and empower, but personal circumstances require personalized advice. We'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, FindAGreatAttorney.com. If you or a loved one has been injured in an accident, finding the right lawyer can make all the difference in getting the compensation and support you deserve. Welcome to another edition of Justice in Scrubs. I'm attorney Richard Hastings, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Dr. Jeff Michaelis.
And today we have a most interesting guest, and he is the gentleman that might stand between you and death. He is an EMT, and his name is Matthew Casavecchia. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, and welcome.
Thank you for being here. So let's start off, if we could, and hear about your background.
So my background has always really been centered around emergency services. I started as a volunteer in the town of New Fairfield, where I grew up, as a volunteer firefighter. And I was attracted to the ambulance. Something about the ambulance and EMTs really got my attention and my passion. So I took an EMT class at the Danbury Hospital, and then really I got kind of furthered my career, became a paramedic, and then got into supervision and management, and then eventually the director of the department.
And where do you currently work?
I currently work at Danbury Hospital, where I oversee a number of ambulance programs in the immediate area, and then some regional programs as well, as in addition to the conveyance activities, meaning transport activities between hospitals.
Now, I know that I was an EMT when I was in college.
Right.
And I know the training was like once a week for a couple of months. And can you tell us about the training, if someone's interested in training, and what different levels there are? Like you said that you're a paramedic, which is a higher level.
Right. So the EMT program is roughly about 155 hours or so. It depends on the program. Some are once a week, some are every day, some are on the weekend. So there's a variety of different programs that are offered in the area. The EMT training encompasses everything from lifting and moving of patients to driving to CPR responses, cardiac emergencies, respiratory emergencies, delivering babies, handling anaphylaxis or allergic reactions. So there's a lot of different areas that the EMT program covers in a very short period of time, meaning 150 or so hours.
And what about the paramedic program? That's a higher level, right?
So the paramedic program is much higher. There's a lot more training. Many of the paramedic programs now have affiliated with colleges, universities. So it's about a 2-year program. And that particular program encompasses a lot more detail and comprehensive strategies to manage emergencies. Advanced airway management in the form of intubation, managing cardiac emergencies and defibrillation, and a lot of different medications to manage a variety of different medical emergencies that are encountered in the pre-hospital environment.
So the paramedic can actually intubate someone on the field.
That's right. So the paramedic, in the event, and what is intubation? Well, in the event that someone stops breathing, they need their airway to be secured. A paramedic can advance a specific airway, a tube, into somebody's trachea and into their lungs, and we could ventilate that person, in the pre-hospital arena until they arrive at the hospital.
As far as medications go, you can deliver the medications, but don't you need an approval from the emergency room doctor? How does that work?
This is a good question. Paramedics operate under the license of a physician. So we have what is called medical control, and there's two aspects of medical control. There's one aspect meaning standing orders, meaning we could provide interventions on standing orders and protocols. And then there's also direct medical control, where we would actually need to engage a physician on the phone or over the radio on specific orders that may be delivered for a particular patient in a patient scenario. We always have the ability to get a physician online in the event that we don't know or have some questions or concerns about a patient, and ask for specific medical control advice, suggestions about how we may be able to manage a particular scenario. And those do come up on occasion.
Now, the standing orders, what are some typical standing orders that you have that you're allowed to administrate under circumstances?
So a good one to talk about is cardiac arrest management. So we have algorithms through advanced cardiac life support, ACLS, that we could administer medications and do certain aspects of clinical care to manage a cardiac arrest, depending on what rhythm the person is in. So medication administration, for example, epinephrine, lidocaine, atropine. There's a variety of different medications that we have and carry that we'd be able to manage, a particular cardiac arrest scenario. And there's other scenarios as well that we encounter. I don't know if we'll talk about it in this forum, but naloxone, Narcan administration is one of those things that EMTs and paramedics alike have really become accustomed to as far as administration, learning and understanding the signs and symptoms of opioid overdoses, and then intervening really quickly with Narcan has been a big change in how we manage these particular situations in the pre-hospital space.
So I'm curious about, I know there's no such thing as a typical day, but maybe a typical week as an EMT. What happens? You get to work, and then what do you do? And then how do you get called out? And just walk us through that whole process.
So a lot of the work that the EMTs do in paramedics is really protocol driven. So we go on scripting, and that starts from the time you check in and check your ambulance fully. So look to make sure that you have adequate oxygen and all the different supplies that you may be able to administer in the event of any emergency in the pre-hospital space comes. So that's the first aspect, is really preparedness, making sure that we're prepared to respond. And then once the ambulance is checked, and that's every aspect of the ambulance, they're ready to go. They check in, they sign on by the radio, and they announce that they're available. They're generally speaking, they're dispatched by a public safety answering point or 911 service that fields the call. When I say fields the call, all of our dispatchers in this area are trained in emergency medical dispatch procedures. So they're able to interrogate the caller, get information which is extremely valuable to the responders, and also give some type of direction to the caller. In the event of somebody's choking, for example, they could walk the caller through how to clear an obstructed airway. So generally speaking, you never really know what could be coming. That's part of, I think, the draw of emergency medicine. But certainly your training and the amount of experience that is gleaned from every day comes to the forefront when you're challenged with a particular call that is complicated.
And are these ambulances at firehouses? Are they at the hospital? Where are these locations?
They're all over. Some are at the hospital, some are at local fire stations, some are at independent ambulance stations. So EMS systems are so unique in the way they are managed and the way they are staffed. But the main thing that brings us all together is we're in the business of saving lives, rapid treatment and transport to the hospital.
So let's walk through a dispatch call. You get a call, and they hopefully tell you what's going on. Do you sometimes prepare, like set up things in the back, or do you call the emergency room and say that we're coming with this, or you want to talk about that?
So there are certain calls that would get our attention, high acuity calls that would definitely get the wheels spinning as far as how we would manage those particular calls. Generally speaking, those would be multiple patient calls or a cardiac arrest of a child. These are calls that would warrant some kind of scripting in our brains, reviewing the protocols. Much of this, by the way, is, depending on your experience level, is done unknowingly, right? So you're going through all of these different things while you're en route. First order of business is get to the scene safely. So there's a red light and siren response that is triggered by these high acuity calls. And we always say to our EMTs, we want you to get there with due regard, safety. A lot of distracted drivers out there and people that don't necessarily pay attention to an emergency vehicle. But we want to get there safely. We want to get there quickly. And certainly for a multiple patient incident, we're on the horn with the hospital letting them know, hey, be prepared. This is what we're hearing. And then when we arrive on the scene, generally speaking, we'll give them an update on sometimes what you're hearing and what is being reported isn't necessarily what you actually encounter on arrival.
Yeah, I know it's an example. When I was training, and I remember walking down the stairway with my attending, and we were going down for a cardiac arrest. And he says to me, "What are you thinking about?" And I gave him a look like, "Oh, I don't know. What am I thinking about?" Because I was trained, right? He says, "You got to think about what you're going. You got to work through the protocol.
Yeah.
You got to work through it on the way over there." And it's the same thing that you guys have to do. It's very important to work through in your mind what you might encounter and what you need to do.
And to that end, really, EMTs are trained, and paramedics, for that matter, are trained. Scene safety is paramount, right? Personal safety is super, super important. And then right after that, what type of protective equipment are you going to be donning? Gloves, gowns, masks, goggles, whatever, right? So face masks. So these are all the types of things that the EMT and paramedic go through every single call, many times unknowingly, because it's just been drilled into their particular brains of how to manage a pre-hospital emergency.
Yeah. Now, accidents happen. They happen unexpectedly, but a lot of accidents you probably can predict, or maybe there's ways of preventing accidents. Can you talk through that a little bit?
Well, the whole prevention piece in pre-hospital care is big, especially when we talk about falls and fall mitigation and fall prevention, as you bring up. And generally speaking, these are falls in the elderly population where we could, send people out in advance and do a home inspection and look to make sure that things such as throw rugs necessarily aren't, or they're secured. They're not in an area where somebody could trip and fall. Lighted areas. Do we need to make sure that there's a walking device or something to that effect? So we do rely very, very heavily on partnerships and collaboration, especially when we have patients that fall with some regularity. We have a kind of a matrix where we're able to alert the physician who oversees that patient and do some follow-up, because it is important. And to your point, many of these things are preventable if we are able to get ahead of them and share information with people who can make a difference. So fall prevention is a big one when we talk about mitigation strategies, and certainly wearing one's seatbelt, car seat safety, all of these different aspects of preventing from any type of accident and injury are super important in our space.
Let's talk about the types of cases that you get typically called out on. Now, certainly elderly patients are people that you get called out on. What are the things? I would imagine car accidents, things of violence. What are the things you typically get called out on?
It's a good question. There are a variety of different emergencies that we respond to, ranging from OBGYN emergencies to overdoses, right? And anything and everything in between. Allergic reactions, falls with injuries, broken bones, sports injuries, motor vehicle crashes, drownings. There's a variety in medical emergencies such as cardiac arrest, what we just talked about. So we're trained to be able to deal with these particular situations. But, it just certainly varies on day to day. But, when we have bad weather, for example, we're kind of leaning forward thinking about bad weather, motor vehicle crashes, especially the first storm. When we have the first storm that comes in, you still have people who aren't necessarily prepared to drive in inclement weather, and we see a lot of motor vehicle crashes and a lot of injuries from those particular scenarios.
Was there any situation where you had to make a split-second decision between life and death, and what about that, and how did that affect you?
Well, there certainly is. When we talk about advanced cardiac life support, rings to the top as far as emergency management of a patient who is has a rhythm which is lethal, right? And if there's not specific action that's taken, in this particular case, ventricular fibrillation, right? So we need to be able to intervene very, very quickly and defibrillate that patient, and then follow up with CPR and then medications, which we spoke about earlier. These are literally life and death split-second decisions that we really need to rely on our training and education, skills, knowledge, and abilities to be able to intervene quickly and reverse that lethal rhythm.
So when you're called to, when you get a call for some type of emergency, what are some suggestions that you could give to people that are there to assist you to make this a better experience for everyone involved?
Well, the first thing, EMS is a system, right? So, and it's a system of what we call chains of survival or links of particulars that need to come together for an optimal result of a patient. The first thing is recognition of an emergency, right? Is there an emergency? And the second thing right after that is activating the 911 system. So those are two big things. If you see something that's going on, somebody having a medical emergency, recognize that they are having a medical emergency and immediately activate 911. There are specific things based on the presentation of the patient that would be helpful. Certainly we want to protect them from injury in the event of a seizure, for example. We want to make sure that that person's is protected from injury, perhaps put on their side to make sure that they don't have any airway obstruction from perhaps vomit or any type of airway secretions. The other thing is tell us a little bit about the patient. What do you know about this patient? Do they take medications? Mm-hmm. Do they have a history of such? If you're waiting for the ambulance, put a light on. If it's at night, put a light on outside. Stay on the phone with the dispatcher, for example. All of these little things kind of come together and do make a difference when we're responding to a call. I always like to say that in the event of a medical emergency or any type of emergency, have someone outside or flag down the ambulance or the police or the first responders to make sure we get there quickly. And then, how we get into the building is really important as well. Now, we'll do that. That's part of our training. But getting there quickly, getting some advanced information is super important when we start managing the actual medical emergency.
So one of the things you talked about, which I think is key, is recognizing a medical emergency. So why don't you give some examples of what people might not recognize is a potential emergency where they should be calling 911?
Well, we always talk about cardiac emergencies, and we're getting better at the recognition of cardiac emergencies, but they don't always present with chest pain. And, people oftentimes when they're having a potential heart attack will say that, it's a little bit of gas, right? A little indigestion. I don't necessarily need to follow up on this. Well, look, there've been plenty of cases that someone who thought they were having indigestion, for example, were actually having a heart attack. Another one is stroke and stroke care, a really intense headache, for example, or, someone who their speech is slurred or maybe their gait is off. These are things that, considering the consequences from waiting and not taking specific action, are significant. We'd much rather have an activation of 911, and we do. And when we get there, the person is okay, but we still want to do a full exam and have them. We're always offered to take them to the hospital. And certainly, if they refuse medical attention, there's a whole different aspect of things that we need to make sure that we take into consideration. Oftentimes people don't want to go. They're embarrassed. They don't think there's a need for emergency medicine follow-up. But we encourage as part of our training to make sure that they make the right call, make the right decision.
And another great point I think you just made is that a lot of these things, like a potential stroke, like a potential heart attack, are very time sensitive. And I think what you're saying is the EMS people would rather you err on the side of making a mistake and saying, I think we need an ambulance, and have the ambulance come out and say, well, you really don't, as opposed to they don't call and then the person has a stroke or has a heart attack and there's irreversible damage because of the delay.
That's right. And I think, from our perspective, when we're getting a 911 call from someone who's reporting a medical emergency, in our minds, the trajectory is that person is going to the hospital because we're not physicians. We work under a license of a physician, but we don't have the tools, certain tools, a lot more capabilities at a hospital where we can't necessarily diagnose certain things. Now, certain things we can, no question about that, but we always want to err on the side of caution. It's better to get checked out by a physician at the hospital, especially if someone recognized an event that occurred that wasn't normal, immediately acted and dialed 911. We'd rather get out there and get that person to the hospital.
So you always bring someone to the hospital, or sometimes you don't?
Well, there's a lot of times we don't bring people to the hospital because they don't want to go. What we call they refuse medical attention, or what was reported initially wasn't necessarily the case. We have some of that as well. But from my stance as an administrative person, when the ambulance is called, we'd want in my view, that person to see all the way through to the emergency department and be evaluated by a doctor. There are times where they don't go to the hospital, and there's a cascade of events that we need to make sure that are in place before that person refuses medical attention. Frankly speaking, there are times where someone wants to refuse medical attention and they're not in a mental state to be able to do that, and we have protocols that manage that particular scenario.
Do you get the police involved in those situations?
We do. We get the police involved in those particular situations as well as medical control. The paramedic, his or her training enables them to be able to kind of walk through these different scenarios and hopefully get that person to make the right call and go to the hospital, which is oftentimes the case.
Do you sometimes recommend a telehealth visit at the time instead of going to the emergency room?
Well, during COVID, right, and COVID was, and we could talk about that a little bit more, I'm sure we will, there was some advances in some of these particular cases. But in the pre-hospital arena, at least in our state, we're not there yet. I think there may be, with the community medicine and paramedicine model, which we can talk about a little bit later, there are models that do have telehealth monitoring visits that are very effective. We're not there yet. I suspect we will be.
We wanted to take a quick break to remind you about our sponsor, findagreatattorney.com. Dealing with the aftermath of an accident or injury can be overwhelming. And the last thing you want to worry about is finding the right lawyer. Findagreatattorney.com simplifies the process by connecting you with one of the top attorneys in your area who specializes in your specific type of case. Whether you've been injured in a car accident, suffered a slip and fall, or experienced medical malpractice, findagreatattorney.com has a network of experienced lawyers ready to help. And remember, their service is completely free, so you can focus on your recovery without worrying about the cost of legal representation. If you or someone you know needs legal assistance, don't hesitate to visit findagreatattorney.com and let them match you with one of the best lawyers in your area for your needs. Let's go over, we'll jump right into COVID. So COVID occurs, and then is that a positive thing for what you do? Is it a negative thing? What are the good things? What are the bad things?
Well, it's hard to really say whether it's a positive or negative. I certainly looked at it that we were, as emergency medical people, always trained for this idea of a pandemic, right? It came up, we talked about it, we ran through the scenarios, but did we really look at it and see how this was going to affect our system? I would venture to say no, that there was a lot of different gaps that were uncovered during the response. The nice thing about it is we were very agile and were able to make very meaningful changes to the system and how we deliver care. But from the PPE perspective, which we got a lot of airtime here, the initial phases of the response was difficult because we didn't really know what was adequate personal protective equipment, we wanted to make sure we were taking care of the first responders, okay, which was the first thing. And then the other thing was, do we have the capability, do we have the capacity of all of this PPE that was being required and consumed? So these were some interesting times. I think one of the major developments from the pandemic was our ability to, and we always knew this, being in the medical field, we were always very adaptive and nimble. But I think we saw a lot of different aspects of care coordination and standing up the O'Neill Center, for example, which was stood up as a mobile field hospital, 100 and some odd beds, a collaboration between the military, the state of Connecticut, Department of Public Health, our hospitals. I mean, these are pretty trying times that, were put into place. But we also did a lot of different things that reacted to the scenario and reacted in a meaningful way, in my view.
So what are some of the positive things that came out of COVID?
Community engagement was huge. This was an all-hands-on-deck situation. What I saw was the community engagement on so many different levels, from the support, the mental and emotional support, to the actual equipment. I mean, we had scenarios where ventilators were being donated, PPE was being provided and donated. These are really important kind of care collaborations at a community level that I had not seen before. So there was a lot of positives. From my perspective, the biggest positive was the community engagement and our ability to work in unison of how we protect first responders, how we can get scripted messaging out to people to be able to prepare and take the necessary precautions to limit the spread of the disease. Now, how effective that was in the end, well, look, there'll be a lot more discussion about that years beyond you and I, but I think there was some very effective strategies that were put into place that kept the system together and ultimately saved people's lives.
Did you ever come into a situation where you're trying to save someone's life and you put yourself in personal danger?
I think that's a good question. I think there are certainly circumstances that have occurred where the EMTs and EMS personnel, their safety could have been compromised. We try not to do that, but there have been scenarios. Ultimately, what we don't want as EMS providers or first responders is to become a victim ourselves, right? Become a part of the problem. We're there to be part of the solution. So we try to go up to a specific point of our training and the equipment that we have. But a failed response would be someone who becomes compromised, injured, or killed. These are things that we want to pay particular attention to, and our training comes upon that. Are there circumstances that are unforeseen that occur? Yes. And are there specific consequences to that? Yes. We try to make sure that we prepare for these things, but ultimately, unfortunately, there are circumstances that have occurred where first responders have been injured or killed in the line of duty.
Yeah. What about abuse? Like, I'm sure that you were called to sometimes a husband was beat a woman or something like that, and then maybe that husband is violent. I assume you get the police involved that situation too.
Back to the idea of our dispatchers collecting information, giving us situational awareness so we have an idea of what's happening, painting this kind of common operating picture of all of us responding is super important. So the 911 dispatcher collecting that information passes it along to the public safety providers, and then we take specific steps to make sure that we're protected. But certainly there are occurrences where all of the information is not provided. Perhaps it's incomplete, or we just simply can't get the information out. And these are the scenarios which we get very concerned about with responder safety.
So that's the time you would get the police involved, I guess.
Correct.
And maybe sometimes the firefighters or something like that.
That's correct.
And you guys work very closely together.
We absolutely need to. It's a team approach. Each entity has specific deliverables that they bring to the response. And those particular aspects of the response have to come together, especially when we have a volatile situation, which you described.
Can you talk about calls that you've been involved in, kind of categories of calls that are most disturbing and most difficult to deal with?
I think the vulnerable populations, from the very young to the very old, are very trying, and from a mental and emotional perspective, it's very hard to experience someone who's vulnerable in their everyday life being severely injured or very, very sick. Those particular cases, I do think, require a little bit of teasing out. And while we have a lot of experience dealing with them, the emotional aspect on that particular response is often problematic. It's troublesome to the responders because, we're there to help and we want to be able to help them, but you can't sometimes think that, gosh, what a horrible circumstance this small child or this elderly person has gotten, not themselves into, but gotten into, oftentimes by things much more beyond our control. And that in itself, I think, creates a lot of stress. Fortunately, we're in an environment now that we recognize these things, and we are able to take specific actions to make sure that our EMS providers, first responders, are taken care of, and they're kind of given the opportunity to talk about these things in a very meaningful way, so they understand that what they're feeling is not necessarily unusual, and there are ways for people to deal with these things, not necessarily stuffing them and not talking about them, or perhaps using alcohol or drugs to deal with them.
So you've also obviously been to many horrific motor vehicle accident sites, and I would imagine sometimes you're the first ones there rather than the police. And can you talk about different scenarios that occur there? I mean, I would imagine that they're family members where somebody's been seriously injured, and kind of the give and take with you and the horror and all of the things that flow from that and how you manage that.
Well, motor vehicle crashes in particular, especially when somebody's trapped in the vehicle and seriously injured, meaning the horrific circumstances of the motor vehicle crash has created a situation where they cannot get out of the vehicle and they're seriously injured. The EMT and paramedic in those particular situations really zone in on that person, especially if they're conscious, they're scared. And the fire department, our colleagues from the fire department, are working very diligently on getting them out. So there becomes a connection, eye-to-eye contact with that person. Sometimes it's holding. Sometimes we can't see their eyes, by the way. So it's a hand. It's a reassurance that, hey, we're here. We're going to take care of you. We're going to get you out of this situation. These are meaningful conversations that take place, and it's a bond that occurs between the paramedic and the person who's been in this, horrific situation. much of what we do is certainly we provide the clinical aspect of care, but there's a lot of support, emotional support that an EMT or paramedic needs to bring to the table to reassure that person that's very frightened, that's very injured, and could potentially die, that we're here and we're going to take care of you. Yeah, there's a lot of that occurs.
And obviously there are situations where those people do not survive. And
right.
There are family members that are around them when that occurs. And I can't imagine, I mean, people say it's not in your line of work so much, but, it's my job. I just have to deal with it. But that's something that I would imagine just touches you so incredibly deeply, especially if it's a child or if it's, somebody that's your daughter's age or your son's age or your parents' age or something that connects you to that person. Right. It must be so tough just to kind of dust yourself off and go to the next call. And how do you manage that? How do you deal with that? How do you decompress from that?
Well, sometimes we don't go to the next call. If it's that traumatic and if that's taxing on the providers, we intervene and say, you know what, let's take a little bit of a break. Let's hit the timeout. Let's hit the pause button. Let's get another, kind of mutual aid service or somebody else to help while we're looking to decompress. There have been those circumstances. And look, we live and work in this community, right? So it's a big community, but it's a small community. And when a horrific circumstance happens, we all feel that. And you cannot help, to your point, identifying with that person. We're humans. Before the uniform goes on, we're human. And that aspect of how we manage these particular scenarios must be taken into consideration. So, and sometimes we have to hit the pause button and just feel the emotions. Let the emotions out. And sometimes they come out in different people in different ways, and we're trained on how to deal with those things. And the nice thing about it is we have a tremendous amount of support. So if it becomes bigger than us, we have clinicians that can deal with these type scenarios and point the first responder, the EMT, paramedic to the right resources to get them the help that they need.
Now, when you come up to a scene and there's some emotional people or people that are out of control or chaotic, I know you probably call the police, but what happens if you get there and the police are not there? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so oftentimes, and we do have those scenarios, oftentimes it's a matter of just, even though it's difficult, just removing them, taking them a little bit away from kind of the immediate crisis and talking them down a little bit is super important. If we have the resources, we rely very heavily on first responders, others to help us, because don't forget, we're there to manage the crisis. Sometimes the crisis becomes a little bit more inflamed, exacerbated by bystanders, emotional people. But we're trained to kind of focus in on what needs to be done and then do it quickly and get on our way to the hospital. There have been circumstances where, especially in an emotionally charged situation, the best place to be is get the person on the stretcher in the ambulance and on the way to the hospital.
Do you have a program for burnt out or other EMT people that are just can't deal with the situation or have trouble getting over situations?
There are mechanisms in place, which I alluded to earlier, where we like to have, first of all, any EMT, paramedic, first responder is an important asset. We want to make sure that they are in a capacity which is 100%. To your point, and what we say to all our EMTs in EMT training class is that someone is dialing 911, you're the person that's showing up. You're the person that has been requested. So you need to be 100% on that, whether it's an injury of an ankle or a cardiac arrest, right? That's their emergency. And we're trained to make sure that we take care of that emergency. So having said that, the mental health piece, the emotional aspect of making sure that our EMTs and paramedics are in a position where they get help has been built into certainly our programs, and I think others as well. We have peers that are trained to recognize these symptoms that perhaps someone isn't necessarily there, and perhaps we need to get that person some additional help.
What are some of those symptoms?
Well, there could be a variety of different things. We could have an employee that, for example, has been a top-notch employee, never misses work. All of a sudden, they're calling out, or they're late, or they're not fulfilling their responsibilities like we would normally see them, or maybe their uniform looks a little bit different, meaning they're not necessarily tucking. There's all these different things that we can pick up on. But I think the biggest thing is we work in partners. We work in teams. So generally speaking, the partner would be able to pick up on these things because we know each other. We work with each other. These people are together in an ambulance sometimes 16, 24 hours in a row. So oftentimes it's the partner that would signal that, hey, something's not right with this individual.
Interesting.
Now, you've been doing this a long time, and you're very experienced, and also you went through COVID, which opened up a lot of difficulties. How would you make some changes now, or what do you recommend in the future to improve the EMS situation in our area?
So what we would really like to see, and I think our state is working towards a community paramedicine model where we have paramedics that are trained, that are integrated into the system that could go do visits of individuals that have perhaps chronic illness. And kind of get ahead of some of these illnesses to prevent transports to the hospital. So there's very well-known programs and very effective programs that I would really like to see come to our state. We are getting close to that end. The paramedic would be able to go and evaluate, along with a partner, a certain situation where someone has chronic illness. So, for example, it's 100 degrees out, right? Hot, humid conditions, and we have people that suffer from asthma, right? We know who these people are, especially the chronic illnesses, and we could potentially get ahead of these situations by visiting them, by taking some specific steps on perhaps it's an air conditioning situation, perhaps it's a medication situation. There's all these different aspects of what we call integrated care that we could share information with physicians, APRNs, nurses, paramedics alike, and kind of get social workers and kind of get this idea of an umbrella of care around them to make sure that we kind of keep them safe and at home. I think that's the care model that we'd like to be able to see, and I think could have tremendous effect on the utilization of emergency services and the utilization of our EDs as well.
How do you determine these patients that need help?
So it's a great question, and thanks for asking it. Chronic conditions, generally speaking, people will call out for us. So we have the ability through data and data analysis to look at certain addresses, for example, of individuals who are high utilizers of the system, and we know what their medical issues are. The idea now is to get ahead of those particular issues, get a care model around them to prevent them from calling 911.
Yeah, so sometimes there could be social issues of determinant health instead of medical issues, right?
Absolutely. This is why I think this umbrella or kind of envelope of care and care coordination is super important, all the way from the pre-hospital to the social workers to all those individuals who may be able to help that person stay in their place of residence, be safe, and not necessarily develop a crisis that warrants a 911 call.
Now, what umbrella would that be under? Would that be under your umbrella or I don't know, some other Nuvance umbrella, or what? How would you recommend that?
Yeah, so a while ago, you may recall this, is we actually did a pilot where we had residents that were attached to our paramedics.
Yeah.
And residents would go out with our paramedics and do these visits. It was a kind of an integrated healthcare model. We'd be able to see real time on a electronic device all of their medical records, et cetera. I'd imagine I'd like to be able to kind of redevelop a program like that, we have, as you know, care models in place that deal with different aspects of care. Now, we have kind of the framework of those where individuals that require specific services, teams of care coordination come together. I'd imagine this model would be kind of attached to the framework of one of those already existing, so we share information around patients that we already know are in the system, that perhaps utilize the system in a highly, and look at ways to mitigate and get ahead of some of their illness. So I'd imagine the framework would be built out from one of those existing programs.
Like Visiting Nurse Association. I think
Something
that's
to that
probably
effect.
a better umbrella than your umbrella.
That's correct. It would, though, it's kind of an all hands because, we may be able to see patients that visiting nurses don't. We may have information, for example, that someone is falling and they're falling with regularity and they're not going to the hospital. So there's no medical record, right? So we'd be able to bridge the gap of, hey, we're going to this particular address with some frequency. They're not going to the hospital. They're going because they need to get picked up. They've fallen. They're not injured. But then that would trigger a cascade of information sharing and next steps, which may include a visiting nurse visit, among other things.
So it should be multi-system oriented.
Absolutely. Look, the collaborative care model that we have embraced as a system, as a network, I think can do so much good and has done so much good for many, many people. I think as we build up our programs, as we look at information sharing and being proactive, I think there'll be a difference in community health, which is most important and really what we're all focused on.
Let me take a different direction if we could and
Sure.
just discuss some feel-good moments in your career. What are some memories that you have where something really great happened and you were just, so appreciative of what it is that you do and people being appreciative of what you do for them?
Yeah, I think there have been many. I think for me personally, it's the cases where some time goes by and someone recognizes me. I'm out shopping, for example, and they'll come up to me and express their gratitude.
Wow.
And that to me, and that I've been fortunate enough to have that happen a number of times. None of us look for that, but it does cause a little bit of pause and maybe a deep breath of this is a serious job that we do, and we can impact people in a very meaningful way, positively and negatively. So when we train people, when we train the EMTs, we really reinforce that you're the one that's being called to mitigate and solve whatever their issue is, and take that moment like this is your family member, this is your father, mother, sister, brother. And I think as long as we maintain that mentality, these occurrences that I've spoken to you about will continue to occur.
Right. So as we are wrapping up our time together, what thought or what words could you share with our listeners that might provide them with some, something that they can use to make their life a little bit better given what you do?
I think always having a plan. When we talk about a plan, we talk about a personal preparedness plan. And I'll put on my other hat here just for a second. When we talk about developing a culture of preparedness, it always begins with the individual. So whether that's having kind of a rendezvous point for someone if there's an emergency in the home, smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors in the home, a way to communicate with family members in an emergency, a list of medications and allergies, for example, and maybe even a family discussion on some scenarios. What if this happened? What will we do? How will we communicate? I think these are the important aspects of developing what we call a culture preparedness and having real partnerships in preparedness. If our community is prepared to deal with anything from a heart attack to a flood event, we're more resilient. We're more apt to be able to recover. And there's study after study after study that speaks to this. So my words are always around personal preparedness, making sure that, and look, nobody wants to be looking over your other shoulder on, what if this is going to happen? But I think kind of a focused conversation on some scenarios and developing a preparedness list of actions and maybe even some supplies, having some, water, some drinking water, for example, having extra diapers if you have small children, all of these different, having a generator, all of these different things. I think it's important when we talk about preparedness, not only from a medical emergency, but all hazards is kind of the buzzword that we're using these days.
So I had an elderly father, and two of the things that we heard, which were quite helpful, were number one, that in his phone to put in the contacts ICE in case of emergency.
Right.
So emergency responders will see that, push that button, and then they know they're speaking to the person they need to speak to in that situation. The other thing, which was incredibly helpful, is to make sure that your parents, especially older people, have a list of their medications. So if they have to go to the hospital in emergency, they have a list of what they're taking. So it makes it so much easier for your job, and it makes it easier for the doctors when you get to the hospital.
Yeah, and make sure that list is updated. We always like to know who the doctor is as well, because again, piecing the care together in the emergency setting, super important. And there's other things that people could wear, perhaps a bracelet that identifies them as a high risk person. All of our EMTs are trained to look for those things, especially if there's an unknown emergency. But I think taking some basic preparedness steps, especially as a son who has elderly parents, for example, these are things that we could potentially help our parents. Or if you're a young mother, a young father, learn CPR, learn how to recognize, a choking hazard for a small baby, or what a seizure is, what a febrile seizure is. All these things are super important when we talk about personal preparedness.
Matthew Casavecchia, thank you very much.
Thank you.